Do you feel that the politicians you dealt with were as straight with you as they ought to have been?
I think I'd need to distinguish. They adopted different approaches. And I have to name names here because these were public sessions. Tony Blair is always and ever an advocate. He makes the most persuasive case he can, not departing from the truth, but persuasion is everything. Advocacy for my position, my Blair position.
Do you feel he was as straight with you as he ought to have been?
There is, I argued, the responsibility on the leading politician of a government, both to make the case for the policy decision taken, but also to balance that with realism about risks, downsides, counter-arguments. If you act simply as a one-sided advocate, you risk losing that. And I think that risk did come about.
And indeed your report says, for example, on the intelligence,
yes,
he gave it a certainty that wasn't justified. I mean, that's another way of saying it was exaggerated, isn't it?
He found, I don't know whether consciously or not, a verbal formula in the dossier in his foreword to it, which said, and used it again later, I believe the assessed intelligence shows beyond doubt. Pinning it on my belief, not on the fact of what the assessed intelligence said. Now, you can make an argument around that, both ethical and, well, there is an ethical argument, I think.
Do you think it was ethical to do that?
We criticised it and said it shouldn't have been done.
But was it ethical?
I don't know that I'm not an ethicist.
Do you feel he gave you the fullest version of events?
I think he gave what was, I hesitate to say this rather, but I think it was, from his perspective and standpoint, emotionally truthful. And I think that came out also in his press conference after the launch statement. I think he was under very great emotional pressure during those sessions, far more than the committee were. He was suffering, he was deeply engaged. Now, in that state of mind and mood, you fall back on your instinctive skills and reactions, I think.
But he was relying, you suggest, therefore, on emotion, not fact.
Both. I mean, fact insofar as there are facts, particularly in the intelligence sphere. Nobody should be allowed to become a senior minister reading intelligence without undergoing a training course. That was a diversion, but it's also true.
But just having been part of those incredibly intense sessions and then having studied that version of events along with the enormous array of documentary evidence that you had,
yes,
just in the most simple terms, do you believe that Tony Blair was as straight with you and the public as he ought to have been?
Can I slightly reword that to say, I think any Prime Minister taking a country into war has got to be straight with the nation and carry it, so far as possible, with him or her. I don't believe that was the case in the Iraq instance.
In your view, was it a necessary war? I mean, you say plainly in the report the peaceful options had not been exhausted.
Indeed. To that extent, it doesn't satisfy the last resort criterion. To that extent, not necessarily for the United Kingdom to join. I leave the Americans to make their own argument.
Is there a case, do you think, for politicians involved to face some kind of further test, to face the law?
I can't think what it would be. There isn't a court. In theory, the General Assembly of the United Nations could commission the International Court of Justice. If it's not a court internationally recognised, you haven't got an authoritative verdict as an outcome. So, other than reputational damage, what's involved? I take a more nuanced position, if I'm allowed to, which is that it could have become a necessary war had the intelligence proved to be more reliable than it proved to be, but later. And in effect, it's the Colin Powell position. Don't exclude war, but don't do it yet. It's not necessary yet.
I mean, when you read through the information in your report, particularly about preparation, it's astonishing. Yeah. Whose fault was it? Because it must have been somebody's fault.
The critique that we mount and mounted, and I still stand by, was that a Prime Minister at the head of the government of a large country can't be expected to run a war on her own. What we say he could and should have done was appoint a very senior non-departmental minister to run the show and coordinate otherwise very senior ministers, Defence, Foreign Office, and pull it together. And the fact is, there was no, I think we used the rather idiomatic term, there was no buy-in by all the different departments and arms of government.
Does that mean then the British government put British servicemen and women and Iraqi civilians in harm's way unnecessarily?
In harm's way, certainly.
Having studied it in such detail, seeing for the first time before any of us those notes, those intimate notes between
Yes.
Tony Blair and George W. Bush,
Yeah.
do you think the relationship between the US and the UK at that stage was appropriate? Was the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President appropriate?
I think that the fundamental British strategy was fractured because our formal policy right up to the autumn of 2002 was one of containment. That was the concluded decision of Cabinet. But the Prime Minister was running one of coercive diplomacy with the knowledge and support of the Foreign Secretary, but the Foreign Secretary hoped that diplomacy would win and not coercion. I think with the Prime Minister it's probably looked the other way around.
So it was clear to you that Tony Blair was running his own game with George Bush, while the rest of the government, apart
Yes.
from one or two people, didn't know what was going on.
That was the fact of the matter. Tony Blair made much of, at various points, and still does, I think, of the need to exert influence on American policy making. To do that, he said in terms at one point, I have to accept their strategic objective of regime change in order to exert influence. For what purpose? To get them to alter their policy? Of course not. So, in effect, it was a passive strategy. Just go along.
Do you think he was almost played by the Americans then?
We certainly concluded that the amount of effective influence exerted was very slight and short-lived. Clearly getting George Bush to go to the United Nations in September 2002, but that only lasted 2-3 months. When it comes to the immediate post-invasion era, it's pretty much zilch.
When you saw some of the most notable documents that emerged,
Yes,
and I'm thinking, of course, of the note,
of course. I shall be with you, whatever.
what did you think when you saw that for the first time?
You mustn't say that.
Because?
Because you're giving away far too much. You're making a binding commitment by one sovereign government to another, which you can't fulfill. You're not in a position to fulfill it. I mean, he didn't even know the legal position at that point.
You do make the point very clearly, in very polite yet quite damning terms, that the ways in which the legal decisions were taken were far from satisfactory. What did you mean by that?
I suppose if you take it right to the sharpest point, the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, was able, by middle of February, to say that I think there is not only a reasonable argument you can make, it might not prevail, but you can make a reasonable argument. That was early February. Then under some pressure, I think the better view is that Resolution 1441 by itself, without further resolutions, could sustain the argument of legality. His legal secretary writes to the Prime Minister's Foreign Affairs Secretary at that moment and says, there needs to be very strong evidence that Saddam is in continuing breach. And what happened? Prime Minister takes no advice from anyone as to the strength or quality of the supporting evidence, doesn't discuss it with any colleague, and simply instructs the private sector right back to say it's fine. Now that is perfunctory to an absurd degree. So a failure of process. For me, that's very striking.
Having studied the aftermath as you did, do you think fundamentally that Britain's involvement in Iraq has made the Middle East, and therefore by extension our country, less stable, more dangerous?
I think it is necessary to say that the security failure in Iraq, both Iraq as a whole and in the southeast where we took responsibility, can only have disrupted not only Iraq itself, but the whole balance of power, Iran, Iraq, Gulf states, the rest, and indirectly Syria. Libya is a possible exception up till much later. But what I do think is that the failure of security was staring people in the face from very early on, certainly from the autumn of 2003, by the very latest at the end of 2003, and far too little was done about it. Now, could anything useful have been done about it? You could have poured in more resources, you could have confined your activity, you could have put more weight on the Iraqi political community. But nothing happened until it was frankly too late.
Do you think we could ever go to war in the same way, given what your report uncovered?
Oh yes, in an existential crisis, certainly, no question about it. And I don't think we would need a War Powers Act to prevent us to do that. But more generally, I think we've seen evidence of, not of a failure of nerve, but of an insistence on much better control of capacity, resources, before reaching a decision to do something on that scale. And I don't think that's wrong.
So you believe the report should, in theory, could stop a similar rush to war, where not enough was being done, whether in the legal process or the intelligence process, to be sure that it was the right thing?
I had so many years in Northern Ireland where the troops were, after all the evolution of our presence there, given extremely clear instructions and orders as to how to operate. No such instructions or operation guidance was given at all at the beginning of the Iraqi fight. What do we do when a bunch of Iraqis come at us and we've got rifles? Do we shoot or not shoot? Nothing. Now that can never happen again. That was awful.
And
that was
you
professional
believe
failure.
That's because the report has brought in a new level of challenge, you believe?
I believe so. In fact, I'm assured so, and hope it's so.
By whom? What assurances have you had?
The rising generations of military. They don't want to be in that position and face a report like ours in 10 or 20 years' time.
So the rising generations of the military have told you they won't make the same mistakes again because of the report?
Yes, and they weren't their mistakes.
What about the families?
Yes.
Do you think the report changed things for them?
Well, I can only report what actually happened on the day of the launch. I was extremely uncertain as to what kind of reception we would get. We gave the families an hour and a half before I went into their room, and I didn't know whether you'd get booze or brickbats or even rotten tomatoes. Instead, we got loud applause. I then made a little talk, and at the end of that, even louder applause and thank yous and whatever, without real dissent from anywhere in the room. And then on the occasion of the actual launch statement at the end, there was, I think, something close to a standing ovation from some. Now, the sense of relief I experienced was huge.
What was the worst thing about it for you?
A profound disappointment at the failure of professional standards in both civil and military government in too many cases and on too many occasions. I mean, things had really not gone at all well. And that there was individual failing as well as collective institutional failing.
And in terms of the best thing about the report's impact?
My hope is that some future minds will have been changed, because you can't just say that block of volumes never existed. It's there now. It's standing in the way of a retreat back down the road to a lesser standard.
Can you take us back to the moment when you had the first phone call asking you to chair the inquiry, and what did you think?
Cabinet Secretary telephoned, said, "There's going to be an announcement this morning that there's to be an Iraq inquiry. You're going to chair it?" I said, "Well, I'd quite like to think about it and the terms of reference and the membership and the procedures." He said, "Well, I can give you about 8 minutes."
8 minutes?
Yes or no? I said, "Give me a minute." And then I said yes.
So you're glad you said yes when you had a couple of minutes to think about it all those years ago?
Now yes, but there were moments in between. But yes.
Great. So John, thank you so much.